I went to that churchyard because every town has a story like this, and because I wanted to hear the quiet behind it. If stories like this hold you as they hold me, stay close and subscribe because the pieces I lay out will fit together on their own, and when they do, you will want to know what else we almost corrected into waking. The hill rises gently under the 3 U's, and the Lichgate roof is low enough that I have to duck. It is October, which means the grass drips like washed hair and the crows speak only to one another. I came with a satchel and a permission note from the clerk, and I came with a legend in my mouth like a penny. The boy buried alive, the little bell that rang after the mourners left, the sexton who ran too late, the glass clouded with breath, the tamping of soil on a lid pressed from within. A story so insistently told that it had worn a groove around the grave itself. Dates you could trace with your finger, 1859. A plate that had turned first green then black. That was what they said. Inside, the nave smelled as it always does in places like this, like iron that has never quite dried and linen that has eaten years. Wax clung cold in the pew grain. The clerk led me down to the vestry with keys on a loop and said I could have 2 hours with the parish register and the sexton's day book and the receipts from Pritchard, cabinet maker and undertaker, High Street. When he left, the door kissed shut with its own small sound and I was alone with the paper. The parish register is not a storybook. It lists births, marriages, burials, fees and names of the trembling and the nearly drunk. The burials page for 1859 has 21 entries in a neat, bladed hand. There is a child, unnamed, infant male of Sarah Ellery, buried with fee remitted. There is a fee of 3 shillings for brick lining withheld, and in the margin the sexton has made a mark that is not a date, though it looks like one. It is 4 characters but they refuse to be obedient. The ink has gnawed, and the 4 look like the year we all say, but the tails of them curl in ways that reminded me of cabinet maker's scribe marks. When a carpenter wants 2 faces to meet, he writes them into marriage with a whisper of graphite. Small arcs, triangles, a set of lines that put together wrong will not hold. I've seen those on old coffins. It was a thought, and then it was a certainty that I did not yet know what to do with. I took out the first of the museum notes I had requested. It had arrived choked in popping paper and string, with the smell of dust that has learned people's names, and I prized the lid up. There was a rubbing, done with lampblack on a paper that had grown translucent. The headstone for the Ellery child had been rubbed like a back under a surgeon's hand. The letters clean, the edges less so. The rubbing showed the name Ellery and a short phrase. What struck me was where the numbers sat at the edge, faint, half outside the border like something written for the mason's eye, not for the mourner's grief. The numbers were what they told me they were, 1859, but they wore their clothes wrong. The 1 had a crossbar at the bottom as if to marry to a line I could not see. The 8 was open on one side, like 2 circles not touching. The 5 had a notch you use when aligning a board with a tongue. The 9 did not close and the tail dipped as if to point true north. The sexton's day book is more than a list. It is the life of a man who measures the earth with his feet. He writes, hard ground. Child's pit is spared the chalk. He writes, wind, a bell outside of itself. He writes, Pritchard sent the men with handles free. Plate was late. No viewing by request. And then 2 pages later, a scab of pencil that has been pressed until the paper took an impression that has survived the wiping of an eraser. The marks are not numbers, and then, underneath, the 4 shapes again, copied or traced or tried on for size. That same wrong rightness. I traced them with my finger and the oil on my skin made the line glow for a second. I went back to the grave in the long light and took the rubbing myself, because the first one was old and needed corroboration. The wet stone gummed the paper as if kissing. I rubbed with heel of wax crayon, light, then heavy, hearing the faint rasp like a distant file. The numbers appeared, and the lamb, and this suffer the little children, and then on the bevel at the base, half hidden under the rise of the turf, the 4 marks, not one of them placed where a date would usually sit. They ran like a set of little waymarks, each towards a cardinal point. In my notebook I wrote them one after the other. 1 foot of stone east. 8 west bevel. 5 south face. 9 north face low. I tell you now, before the pieces begin to lean into one another, if this is the kind of puzzle that sinks its teeth into you, come with me through the rest and subscribe because what I find at each joinery will ask you to relearn what a number can be, and by the end you will want to know where else we have mistaken instruction for history. The undertaker's receipts were folded around stiff as if they remembered the pockets they lived in. To coffin, elm, child size number 2, shellacked with Japan plate, 2 shillings 6 pence. To fittings, number 12 Oxford pattern fixed handles, 4, screws, coach nails, 9d. To bell and watch rope apparatus with iron bracket and hole made good, 1 shilling. I turned the bills over and found on the back of one, where he had used the paper for a second purpose, a drawing. A lid with a little round labeled simply, glass. It is not every coffin that bears a glass, that is for the worried or the wealthy. A vigil pane for the living to keep check of the dead, for those who feared the grave would take breath that had not quite left. 1859 was a fever year, who can blame them? There was a carpenter's notebook, too, preserved in the museum because there had been a flood, and the water had lifted the margins with such grace that you could see how he had built his life. He writes of deal boards 2 1/2 by 7 nailed to cheeks, and shellac to bring the color. He writes the words, seal made good, when he means the quick work of wax and resin over a joint to keep the perfume of varnish in and the smell of soprotic air out. But here and there the word changes. He deletes the S and leaves eel, or strikes the last letter so that the word shivers into C. The page with 1859 on it, though it is not 1859, has a line of scribbles that are not scribbles at all. Against the sketch of the lid, he has written 1 at the head, 8 on the left cheek, 5 at the foot, 9 on the right, and lines to a figure that looks like a compass. Underneath he writes, lay by sign. All will hold if not named as year. I'm not a superstitious man. Names hold power if you let them, and the past is a flexible container. But I closed the notebook when I read that and went to find someone who had been there, because a page can be fanciful but a witness smells like an old cupboard, and that is the truth. The midwife's diary had not been catalogued as such. It sat as Journal Domestic, in a box of cloth-bound notes. I lifted it up and the cord disintegrated like hair under bleach. The cover had sunk into itself as if kneaded too often, and the edges were smooth where anxious thumbs had rubbed. She writes of noise and of silence. She writes that on the 12th of March she was called for Sarah Ellery, who labored and then did not labor. The child slid and was quiet, she writes. I rubbed linen warmed at the grate and held him to find heat of him, and there was none. He made a mouth as if to say something. I set him where he must be set. Sarah slept the sleep that is ordered for the bereaved. I washed, I bound. Mrs. Pritchard came with a dram. Mrs. Fowler fetched a little glass for the watching. My hands smelled of iron, which is not what they ought to smell of, not until there is a month on the blood. I asked Mr. Pritchard if he had any charms to set, as I had heard some men keep such things under the bench. He said only screws. She writes of the church bell rung slow before the procession, of the little bell she had seen in pamphlets, wired to the hand of the dead. I had not asked for it for any child before, she writes, but there is a smell to some that have not gone, a smell like iron rain and linen wet under the eaves, and the little glass when you look long, you can think you see your own face but it is not your face. I asked for the watch rope with the bell. They were glad to sell it. The safety bell is one of those Victorian concessions to fear that becomes in turn an object of cruel fascination when the fear is no longer yours. A wire runs from the hand inside to a small bell on a bracket by the stone. If there is motion below, if the hand jumps or settles or the gases within build and shift, the bell rings. There is meant to be a gardener appointed to listen in the night. There are 100 reasons for a bell to ring and none of them admit the thought that wants in. The receipts and the day book agree, the Ellery burial had one. Rope tested. Bracket installed. There is a diagram with the 4 numerals set around it. The bell was mounted at the northeast of the stone. It had rained then cleared the day I first heard it. This is where the first of the 3 moments you will want to argue with yourself about lives. A bell is not supposed to sound on a day with no wind. I was down at the foot of the plot with my paper and wax, and the grass made its cold little announcement against my knees. The rope, what remains of it, shrank into the soil like something ashamed of itself. The bracket had been taken in, unbolted, and the hole filled with a stiff patch of mortar that had set proud. There should be no bell. The ewes stood like widows. The crows had left, and the sound that came was so fine I thought a fly had crawled into my ear and rung itself there. Ting. Not again and then a small interval ting. There is a tremulousness in the metal that the years do not forgive, the way an old coin will ring like a bell if you flick it. The sound came from nowhere, which is to say it came from precisely the place my head had put it and knew that it could not live there. Ting. I stood and the rope in the ground flexed. It did not move like something pulled, it moved like something in the earth had pushed up against what it was once tied to. The clerk came around with keys and a grin that said, "So you heard the story then?" before I opened my mouth. He said the bracket had been taken off in 1883. He said there was no bell now. Then he said, without meaning to, that sometimes people leave things behind. The wind began and did not speak of bells, It moved the wooden pawls on the lichgate with the flat sound of a hand pressing a door. I worked late at the little museum that night. There is a room there they keep things in that they do not like to bring out. It has cabinets full of glass eyes and funereal cuffs and black-edged tickets that once lived on the doors of tenements. There is a smell of polish over everything, the good oil that has kept grief from rotting on us. My notes on the marks began to make a different sort of sense when placed one on another. For numerals that were not numerals. The carpenter places them to indicate orientation and order. The sexton makes a set of them in the margins when there is something he wants not to think about and cannot let go. The midwife only writes numbers when counting children, but once she writes them in the span of a line, 1859, and then writes, "Do not say a year that is not a year," and I think she copied it from someone's talk and her pen had a mind. There is a trick with certain varnishes. They blush when damp, they bloom with a cloud, and then with warmth they clear again. Shellac, in particular, tastes like the inside of an instrument when it sweats. The undertaker notes shellac to lid, and then, wax, and then in the margin, we keep the edge bare. Why would you leave a strip unsealed? Unless you needed a place where something could breathe and then could be stopped from breathing. The vigil glass is set at the head over the face. Some are small and some are large. This one, if the drawing is right, is the size of a saucer. It will fog if there is breath or rot enough to warm air. That is the point and the cruelty of it. But the instructions in the carpenter's little drawings, if I am reading them with the eyes he meant me to borrow, do not point to ventilating anything living. They map pressure points. They call for who a board must be laid by. They set out where a nail must go to hold a strain not from without, but within. There is something you can do with wood if you want it to resist popping from a pressure, and it is not the way a man nails if he is only keeping things together through a funeral and into the mild summer rot. I spent afternoons in the archive and evenings in the churchyard and one dusk inside the church when the bell invented by fear rung its own echo in my head. In the museum, the clerk let me handle the child's plate, the Japan medal that once lay like a long thought across the lid. It was small and oval, just enough to take a name and a date if there had been one. There were scratches on the reverse where hands had tried to pry it free with a thin tool and had not, and then had stopped and then had tried again. On the face, beneath the black, there were 3 layers. Letters raised and then worn back, and a pattern beneath the pattern that was the work of a small chisel. The museum notes said, "Plate recut 1872 by order of churchwardens," and "original inscription removed or abraded, traces of earlier engraving visible at angle." I cleaned the face with a little breath and lint and watched as the light moved across it like a tiny tide. The black lacquer breathed. It let me see where the metal dipped and rose. The numbers 1859 were present, they were neat and they were not proud. Under the 9, if you tilted the thing like a magician tilting a coin, the ghost of a different cut came up and met my eye. A notch, the kind of notch Pritchard had drawn when marking where to sink a screw into a cheek. Along the rim on the underside were 4 pricks. Not decoration. Registration points. A plate can be placed on, it can also be placed by, and locked into rotation by things that are not decorative but that claim to be when asked. I went home with my head full and the penny taste still in my mouth, and I set my satchel down and breathed, and the smell that came up from the leather was all the rooms I had been in layered like coffin boards. Wax, mold, wet iron, linen soap, the dry fruity smell of shellac that has kept for more than a century and will keep for a century more if you let it. I woke to the thought that the marks were not just carpentry. They were lay-by signs in the carpenter's own unholy hyphen. They were seals, as the sexton had consciously not written before crossing the S, and the midwife had broken into syllables. When you have something you do not want to call a seal because the church has an opinion on seals, you call it a number. You call it the year. And so the plate read 1859 and was placed with the 4 pricks aligned to the 4 marks on the rim of the lid. And you do not move a plate once set if you do not want to lift what it keeps pinned. But someone had recut that plate in 1872. The churchwardens had decided that the family name should be neater, perhaps an aunt asked. The mason had pried and levered and turned. If he did not know the business of the pricks and their matchings, he would have put the plate back on after polishing without thinking any thought but, there. And yet the wardens had written in minutes that I read, plate made right. Numbers set as becomes. As becomes, which is to say upright. Not wherever the carpenter had put them. What happened next in that century is lost because nobody wrote down the moment when the seal turned and the glass fogged and the little bell shook because the rope had slackened anew. The day book leaps 3 months and says only, vigil ceased. The midwife writes, I am not called for Sarah's scar. She writes later of a cat that will not go to the hearth with its back to the room. She writes of Mr. Pritchard's boy becoming unwell and then well and then unwell, which is to say he drank. By now I had bored the clerk, who kept asking when the film would go up and whether anyone watched these things, and I kept saying, almost no one but the ones who do never leave. He gave me the key to the crypt because he thought turning a camera on old iron would wear the weariest of internet's patience and he could go home. I went down with 2 lamps and a roll of paper for rubbing in my satchel and a coil of quiet. The crypt door's lock is the kind that has been oiled by men who like the sound of it clearing. It has that unfriendly weight of iron that feels both damp and dry. Below ground, the breadth of the place is knee-height, and your thighs are warm and your shins are cold, and you step like someone who has been kicked once and will not be again. They kept the old planks used for resting the coffins before lowering, and they had kept the beer, and there were places where the walls wept the exhausted salt they have collected from all the tears they have absorbed and then given back. The Ellery vault is not a vault. It is a niche with brick and iron and a lintel that pretends to be stone. There is no lid to slip aside. There is only a small opening made right with mortar and then made wrong many times over by fingers and belief. On the shelf, wrapped in sacking and then paper, as if someone had both loved it and wanted it not to breathe, lay the original bracket and the bell. If you want the second of the tight turns in this story, here it is. There are bells that ring when you ask. There are bells that hide their weight until you need lightness. I cleared the paper, careful not to let the dust scatter too much, because in that dust is all the names said near it, and I do not like to stir them. The bell was small, and it had a heart like any bell has, and it had a skin of oil that has become sweet over time. I wiped a thumb along the rim and then immediately regretted it because my thumb smelled of wax and damp iron, and I do not like to keep such a smell under my tongue. I lifted it to the lamp. When I breathed, my breath moved the dust and I saw that the inside was not as clean as the outside. There are those who think such bells are nonsense. Time thinks otherwise. Do not handle a thing like this without expecting it to speak into your hand at least once. When I touched the heart with a nail, minimally, the glass next to it clouded. I had not noticed the glass at first because I had not expected to find a glass loose. It lay to one side, not set in a lid, cleanly cut, with a nice rolled edge where the metal frame had once clamped it. Vigil glass, kept as a record because it was unusual. The museum is cheap and the church is a museum without admitting it. It is indecent to say that something fogged from the inside when there is no inside, but the eye sees what the mind trembles around. The glass was clear, then it had a soft breath on it that made a richness reluctantly become velvet, and then the breath marked itself in ridges the width of a child's lungs, and then it cleared the way shellac blush clears from the edges in. I set the bell down the way you set a thought you have just had that you do not want to have again. I put my ear to the stone because one does, and of course the stone was stone, and there was nothing behind it but stones, and between the stones an air cold enough to pick your teeth with. I lit the second lamp because the first had decided to flicker in a manner I do not enjoy paying attention to, and I rooted in my satchel for the additional notes the museum had been late with. There were 2. One was a copy of the churchwarden's meeting where they had made right the plate. The second was a scrap, pinned to the undertaker's account for the Ellery child, with Mr. Pritchard's own hurried hand, which was not a beautiful hand, saying, "We fastened and sealed, not naming the year aloud, to lay by sign as per instruction of the midwife who had her own. For the love of God do not reset upright. The numbers are elsewhere and you will have to squint to see them. Those who read the year read wrong. This is to keep what has come once from coming to sit and stare. There is a bodily reaction you have when another century reaches a hand across to your wrist and presses where your pulse is. My feet were not inclined to stay. But my head stayed longer, long enough to pull from the satchel the rubbing and align the 4 marks on paper with the 4 iron points set into the crypt wall that everyone else had mistaken for places to hang flower wreaths. The pricks in the underside of the plate, the marks on the post, the numbers on the bevel, the little notches on the carpenter's drawings. They made a calibration that had not cared about years and had only been forced later, to wear a date the way a guard wears a sash. It is hard to tell a camera that it ought to care for the breadth of a glass that does not have a container attached to it. It is harder to say to people that evidently practical men had written out a ritual in their own hands and then disguised it as a date on a plate and marks for a mason. But if you have watched my work, you have watched me lay one thing on another and hold them to the light until they show veins. The midwife's page for the burial day says this: "He was of a quiet, but often those that are quiet will not have light." We said what was ours to say. Mr. Pritchard and Mr. Farlow, sexton, made their removed thing. I put the band on. I do not like pins, but there were pins. 9. We turned and faced him wrong. We shook the little bell to prove him wrong. None of these things are in the book, so we were careful to keep the book's face to any that came in. She goes on to say, "There are tears like rain and then there are tears that smell of iron in the pan." We got the second kind. I have had them once before with a man that went one way and then came back another. The bell rang after, but we knew it would. The glass took tea. It gave it back like a mirror gives back your face if you go to it in the dark with a candle. The past is not a place. It is a set of routines. Enough people doing a thing the same way because they liked how it quieted the wrong noises. They left arrangements like carpenter's joints that only look like decoration. The primary rule of old things is not to put them back upright. Just because your eye itches. And this is where I will say the most obvious thing I should have said to myself. Do not correct an inscription without knowing what it is pointing at. But curiosity is a kind of hunger. I looked at the plate, and I looked at the bracket, and I looked at the 4 iron pegs in the wall where once the bracket had been and where it had been placed at a quarter turn off from what a man would do if he were not thinking. And I thought, I will show you. I will show you how a year is not a year. I will set it where it reads wrong, and I will film it, and the proof will be in the quiet. I had brought wax to catch the marks. I had brought a strip of linen in case I needed to bind anything because I am practical and partly because I carry things like this like talismans and pretend they are craft. The bell's bracket wanted to seat itself. It knew its wall. The pegs were iron and had at their heads little lines scratched once and then smoothed by the solution that weeps from stone. Those lines matched what the rubbing had told me, the little crosses and arcs. If the plate needs to sit with them, so does the bracket. I turned the bracket and rested it at the one quarter that did not look right. The bell hung still. The rope was gone. I would have had to thread a new one if I had wanted the sound, but I did not. I was not here for that. I was here to set one piece where another piece wanted it. The camera watched. The lamp watched. I took the plate, the lovely Japan plate that had once been on a lid that was somewhere below being asked to keep its silence, and I tried its underside's little pricks against the brackets for. There is a satisfaction when things seat the way they mean to seat. It is a sound, it is also a lack of sound, a cessation of a complaint. The plate sat and became quiet. It was now wrong by the face of it. If you stood upright and read the numbers as we always read, they were all the wrong way. If you bent and knelt and tilted your head the way you would to read a master's joinery marks, they came into a sequence. It is obscene to say, I felt proud. I felt like I had taught something to behave as it had once behaved, and that is my worst habit. I lit a little more lamp, because this is work done in light. Above me the church shifted the way heavy buildings shift when they have held their breath too long. It is only settling, you tell yourself. Old timbers have their own tides. In such a hemmed-in place you hear every drop of condensation find its place like a foot lightly down on a stair. The glass that had cleared after fogging earlier was clear again. It lay like an eye turned false way. And then, as if on the measure of some hidden counting, it rouged. Not everywhere but where breath touches first. There is a grief that is scentless. There is another that carries iron up like a tide. I smelled that. My tongue went metallic. This is where the third moment happens, and it is also not a single moment but several. When we say revelation, we mean both the uncovering and the thing uncovered, and the price you pay. I have said there are 4 marks and that they are not numbers. I have said the carpenter's marks and the sexton's and the midwife's correspond to rules that are not on the vicar's reading list. I had made the bracket like a compass. I had made the plate like a key. I had turned the year back into instruction. Instruction points at force, not at time. The bell for which there was no rope had no need of a rope, because I had connected what the rope once connected when it still meant a human hand flushed by fear or by the slow shift of rot. The thing that lay under, what you want to call the boy because that is the story, was not a boy anymore if it had ever been one, if there are things like him at all. It had been pinned by the orientation of objects in 4 places: head, foot, left, right. Pins are not always metal. Pins are sometimes simply agreement. Above, at the edge of hearing, the church's slow bell rolled once like a big ox in sleep. The little bell under my hand refused to be composed. I had not hung the rope. That did not matter. Metal speaks to metal. The bell tongue moved because all the instructions I had so kindly aligned moved. It was not ringing the way a bell rings when you are trying to ring it. It tensed. Metal can do that. You can feel it if you ask a blade about the thing it is cutting. The glass fogged again, and this time the fog did not start at the outside. It grew along a line that matched where a lid might be if you were seeing the face of it without it being there. I put my palm to the vigil glass and I could feel cold as organized as a thought, a rectitude. It was like touching the belly of a fish and feeling the cold of a river run under its skin. I stood back. The camera stayed. It is braver than I am and also does not know anything. A hair, a seam of light you can never find when you look for it, stitched itself along the mortar of the niche as if the old patch were shrinking. It is damp weeping, I told myself. The seal is old. But this is the word, seal. How many times do you have to read it cross out to know it was the word all along? The midwife had written as much and then refused her pen the satisfaction of scrivening a superstition. "Do not name the year aloud," she wrote. I had named it with a plate. I had spoken it in its foreign order. I had put the numbers back into the grammar that made them binding. I had broken whatever weird treaty had been made between those three: the man with the spade, the man with the plane, the woman with the warmed linen, and the little charm she said was not a charm. I had made tidy the thing they had left so agreeably crooked. I am not a religious person, but I have a respect for what is thought to be the right orientation of a body in a Christian grave. Head to the west so that at judgment the dead rise to face east. They had not done that for him. The sexton writes, "Buried wrong way by request." He later crosses out by request. It is shameful in a neat parish. The midwife wrote, "We turned and faced him wrong." Anne Pritchard, "We shook the bell to prove him wrong." I had unwronged what they had wronged on purpose. I am not a man of exorcisms, I am a man of rubbed letters. But in the grim calculus of old trades there are shared corners. The carpenter uses a box to hold a pressure. The midwife uses a band to hold a swelling. The sexton uses earth to hold secrets in their place. I had misread hold and made it restore. When the glass breathed inward, I breathed out. When the bell trembled, I put a finger on it and felt under the metal that there was more happening than sound. It was as if something that had been held in a web that extended beyond the coffin's scant was testing the lay of the threads. You want me to say, "I saw small fingers"? You want me to say, "A whisper came"? I will not say those. They would be less strange than what happened, which was this: everything my work had assembled voted against me. The rubbing paper on which I had taken the stone's face lifted and lilted without draught. The receipts buckled, as if a damp hand were laid on them, impressing an intention. The daybook page where the sexton had pressed his pencil until its ghost remains took a deeper impression, as if the ghost had decided to live again and fill itself. The underlayer engraving on the plate presented a line of notches which, when the lamp wobbled and caught, read as words no one had spoken aloud. Not a year. Not spared. Face wrong side. My own face in the vigil glass stared back at me for the first time, as if the glass had finally found something to mirror. Fog settled from the middle out. It is a dirty trick to tell it like a ghost. It is better to tell it like wood and iron and breath, and that is what I will do. The bands of linen the midwife wrote of, 9 she wrote, are not things I found, but there was a spool of something in the niche, stiff with age and blackness, that had once been cloth, and it lay across my wrist when I reached for the bell bracket, and it was cold in an old way. We think of cold as an absence, but there is a kind that makes felt what it is not, and so it is very present. Outside, the churchyard had the night in it. Inside, the night had the churchyard in it. I could hear the wet iron of gate stones. I could hear a fox laugh itself into a hedge. I had all the names in a book under my hand and their fees and their shortness, and I had a child called Unnamed, and he was the one he was, and he had been something else since. The bell moved like a thought you do not want that goes directly where it means to go. The mortar along the seam of the niche did what old mortar will do if warmed, and there was a thin exhalation from down along the floor that burned cold as it passed my shoes. I had choices. I could lift the plate and turn it to becomes, as the wardens had once done. I could lift the bracket and set it the way a bracket longed to be if it felt duty to uprightness. I could leave in lock and say to the clerk that the film was not useful, and the story is nothing but a story, and the boy was of course not alive, and the bell is a toy our great-great-grandparents bought against their fear of being ignorant. I could put my thumb back where it had ached earlier on the rim and feel wax crumble. I could speak aloud the year and hear it come back as nothing at all. I did none of these things as fast as I should have. There is a kind of pride in our century, pleased with itself for turning the past into a room we can enter and leave. This is not that. It is the past breathing into a room we cannot leave, which is to say the room where a story is true enough to hold your ankle. Something like a clutch, not unlike a baby closing its hand when you press a finger into its palm. Reflex, they say, not intention, ran along the chain of objects I had touched and placed and read. The bracket tensed. The plate warmed, in that way metal does when it is not actually warmer but your skin has been told it is. The 4 iron pegs, one at each quarter, shivered as if a cat had walked along their length. And then I did something I am ashamed of, though if you had been there you might have done it too, and perhaps you will forgive me for it by the end. I put the plate back to becomes. I lifted and turned to upright, to the way a man would make a thing right if his mother were watching and the vicar had a pen. The bell settled. The glass cleared. The seam sighed and then remembered how to behave. I put away the rubbing as if paper could be kept from learning. I put the bracket back on the shelf and laid the plate gently on it and wrapped them again, because what else do you do with things that have had a life? I turned the lamp down and up again to be sure it would not fail on the stairs. All the while my hearing was full up with the little small bell that did not ring. On the way out, I set my hand to the door and the iron was cold with a hint of salt licked into it by centuries of grief-coated hands. I stopped, as if someone who was not my caller had a hold of it, and I listened. The crypt is not silent. Stone has its own gossip. But there is a difference between stone speaking and something else knowing you are a stone with ears. I stood until the lamp began to quit, and then, because the lock is an old lock and old locks do not stand dithering, I left. I locked the door and put the key back on the hook. In bed that night, I held the midwife's page to the light and saw her note written sideways, as if she had not wanted it to be noticed unless you looked. The numbers were laid to the sign and we turned our faces from the date. The little glass knows the warm of those who are not. The bell we shook at the door, not at the head. The rope we did not tie at the hand but at the foot, for he was a wrong-ways child and you know how those are. We pressed where it says to press with wax, head, left, foot, right. We do not name these things. We do not tell. If someone comes to make the world neat they will break it open and think they have only made it right. She underlined do not tell as if telling would make it true. The film is a film and you can watch it when I said it, but if you do, listen with your eyes. The camera shows a bell that does not move. You will say, so what? The camera shows a glass that fogs and clears and you will say, there are thermals. The camera is a liar and a witness and it chose on that evening to be both. I do not know what the thing under that stone is. I do not know if he is a boy or something else wearing the weight of a boy. I do not know if the midwife had a ritual that she copied from someone who copied it from an older thing and for which they used the language of carpentry and sextonry because they had no other vocabulary. I know only that I almost undid and then redid, and that my hands smelled of iron and wax and mold for a day and a night, and when I fell asleep I dreamed that a plank flexed under a pressure from inside and held because someone had put a nail not for strength but for sense. In the morning the clerk texted, if that is not too crude a word to use for a man who collects black gloves so the plate washers don't show their grief, and he asked if I had rehung anything. I said I had not. He released the kind of sound men make when their relief is nearly anger. He said the old women had come to dust the nave and found prints on the crypt door like someone had held their fingers on it to see if it would feel back. I did not go that day, and when I went the next, there were scratches on the bracket where the plate had sat, as if a tiny claw had wanted to write something but decided not to. There is no boy, there is a grave and there is a town that needed a story. There is also a thing that sat under a glass and fogged it when nobody wanted it to, and a bell that rang when there was no wind, and a year I am not any more convinced is a year. We like years because they cage events, we like dates because they pin a life down. These were the opposite. They were instructions. They were the only thing anyone in that time had between themselves and a child that did not lie the way a child's body is supposed to lie when everything has gone sad. The midwife used 11 words to do what the vicar would not do with 5. The undertaker turned his craft into a set of little quarrels with physics. The sexton learned to draw seals that looked like commas. I straightened myself out on the subject when I can by going to other churchyards and seeing what is wrong elsewhere. You would be surprised. Flowers planted at the wrong end. Plates that read left to right but would prefer to be read along the long axis, bracket holes filled off true. And sometimes there is a smell of varnish, iron, linen, mold, wax. It comes along with the damp and you know a thing about a body that was not allowed to lie in peace and had to be persuaded instead. No one has thanked me for not setting the plate as the wardens had. No one has reproved me for thinking to do it in the first place. I live with a door in my head that knows the turn of a key and the touch of a finger and the balance of a bell. It may be that someone else will come along in a later century and make neat what I have left skewed. Perhaps that is how this goes. Every 40 or 80 years, a man with clean hands comes and makes clean what should be left dirty. If I have a letter to leave him it would be this. You cannot correct into goodness a thing that is deliberately untrue in the way a charm is untrue. You can only make it behave like it is true again, and when you do that it will try to breathe. It would be a neat parable if the danger from our errors were contained to crypts and carpenters' marks. It is not. Every archive has a page with numbers that are not years. Every museum has a plate with pricks under the rim there for something other than pride. Every grave digger who lived through a bad spring has an entry that he wrote a little harder. Every midwife had a day when she had to press something into a shape that would keep others from waking too much at night. This is the cost of tidiness. This is the price of making straight. It is also, perhaps, how we keep what is wrong for now from standing up at noon. If stories like this have kept you so far, and if you want to hear what else the years have sealed under dates and the corrections we have been so proud to make, subscribe and stay.